Thanks for the download. As usual, it would be great if you could rate the podcast on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you get your podcast from, as this helps me know how we're doing and brings the series to the attention of potential listeners. The best way to support the pod is via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes. I'm grateful for recent contributors helping to keep production costs to the minimum. My guest today is an old mate, Kim Reid, who appeared on episode 49 when we talked about training at the International Long Range Recce Patrol School, thankfully shortened to the LRRP School, in the 80s. On this one, we discuss life in Germany during and after the Cold War, what it was like to go and exercise, talking about some of the remarkable conversations we had with German World War II veterans. Kim now lives in Germany and tells me about former workmates who served in the East German Army, including a T-55 tank driver, an SS-21 commander, and another who worked for the infamous Stasi. We also discuss how the war in Ukraine is viewed by the Germans. Let's crack on. Last week I was on a phone call to KR here, and we're talking about his sort of East Germany, West Germany, and our time in Dortmund. And he let rip that he had a couple of mates that he works beside, because he lives in Germany now, who were in the East German forces. So you got some interesting characters from your work, Kim. So can you just tell us a couple of these stories you were talking about?
Yeah, one of the first guys I worked with, he said he was in the former East German Army. What were you in, infantry or armour? And you would go, no, I'm artillery. And I said, well, I'm artillery. And he was like, that's very interesting. And he said, what did you do? And I said, I was an observer, artillery observer. I said, what did you do? And he said, I was an SS-21 commander. And I was like, that was our main target, yeah? So I could have seen you maybe a few years later, or if anything had occurred, down the set of binoculars. He said, you would have been my target, yeah? He was going, so, well, were we really important to you? And I said, well, you were like to the artillery, what the Bismarck was to the Royal Navy in the Second World War. I said, you were our main target. But he was a quite pleasant chap, very nice chap. Second guy I worked with was, I think he had something to do with the Stasi, because he said basically his job was to control the trains that went through Berlin and that area around there. And it was to make sure that nobody of his side was thinking about going into the West. But he had a very dry sense of humour, and his catchphrase was always, I'll have to report this. Whatever happened, whatever he found, it was the slightest thing, he would turn to me dryly and go, I'll have to report this.
Was he not wary of saying these things? Because,
No, he wasn't, actually. He did have a tattoo on his arm, and he always had a plaster over it, because he didn't want people to know, but he was very, very dry about it. And I think in the Stasi, there was people that were very high up who did actually the hardcore intelligence, and there's people quite low down, because the state security apparatus they had covered a big field, so to speak. Yeah, so he was made like a sort of, there was even people in car park attendants who were actually in the Stasi.
They had one of the biggest reaches into the state, didn't it, of all the former communist countries. And when the wall came down, people got into the Stasi headquarters and broke in there trying to get hold of all the records. And I was just wondering now, has that still got echoes 30, 40 years later? Are people still worried about?
Yeah, I think there is. I think the Stasi was, of all the security apparatus from the whole of the Warsaw Pact, it was probably the hardest. They seem to be the most vindictive, as you had with the podcast you did about the bricksmiths. You were saying that the East Germans were particularly hard on their reaction towards bricksmiths. There's been a few occasions where they think that Stasi have been involved in instances, or ex-Stasi, have had a grudge against the West, been involved in various things against the West since then.
Do you think that's a carry-on from the Second World War? Or was it in the German character at the time? So the East Germans exchanged one dictatorship for another. The East Germany, the communists never put a denazification process in place over there.
No, they didn't. And I think it could also be a thing that we didn't accept the DDR, the East Germany. We didn't recognize it. So they were always try harder to be better than the other side, to be better than their sort of, what can we say, their masters, yeah, the Russians. There's been various incidents since then. For instance, there was a shooting on the border between a West German and an East German border guard. West German border guard shot an East German border guard. The guy that he shot was called Rudi Alstadt. He was the East German. And he was shot by a guy called Hans Pluschke from the West German border guard. Now, why it happened, we don't know. This Pluschke from the West German side was regarded as not negligent, and he stated fully that he regretted it happened and everything. And in 1989, the wall fell down. In 1998, this Pluschke was found dead in suspicious circumstances in virtually the exact same place as he'd shot the East German border guard. And it was made to look like suicide.
Right.
But he shoots himself in the eye. So it was exactly the same wound as what the other guy from the East German side had. There's lots of, obviously, conspiracy theories, why and wherefore. You have to be quite vindictive to wait that long and do that sort of act as revenge.
You've got the other aspect of when the two Germanys came together. So you had the surveillance side of the Stasi. And even now, the laws in West Germany are very much set up to prevent dictatorships and protect the individual. Now, if I'm right, if you're accused of a crime in Germany, even a murder, whatever it is, they never release a second name. It's always just people's Christian names. Is that correct?
Yeah, virtually. I mean, Datenschutz is a huge, huge thing here. Yeah. And every time you go into the doctors and your new doctors, there is a pile of paperwork you have to fill out. So all your data is kept secure. And they're very conscious of that. Things like in England, we accept video cameras quite openly. Over here, usually they don't want video cameras around. And so this thing from the Second World War, from the Gestapo and the secret police and that, has come over to this side as well. It's in the psyche of the Germans a bit, you could say. There's a form of nostalgia for the East. It's quite strange sometimes. I think it depends on how old you are as well and what you were involved in. It seems to be if you were younger in that time before the wall fell, then it was sort of a very ordered life you had there. You know, you didn't really have any great political views. And if you went with the system looked after you. And one of the astounding things is that I saw recently a program, they were talking about the building projects they had in East Germany for the people there. And they were asking how much rent they paid. And some of them just scratched their head and went, did we pay rent? Because it was taken out, it was so low or so minimal. Yeah, everything was paid by the state.
Yeah.
And it's quite strange. And in some ways, obviously the standard wasn't the same as over here, but it was quite strange. Your life was well ordered and looked after as long as you went with the state. But if you didn't, then that was the problem.
Yeah. And did these guys ever talk much about the day-to-day life? I presume they were the same age as us, roughly.
Yeah, they will be about the same age as us. And obviously, they being in the military, being an officer, things like that, they had more privileges. And that, I mean, if you're in a society like that where privileges are more marked, yeah, if you had a big TV, then you were someone who, or got a TV fast or a car, you were higher up in the social scale there. And so it was very obvious. And, you know, there was always a incentive, shall we say, to toe the line.
I've mentioned in the podcast before, there's a German historian who lives over here who's born in East Germany. She's born in the early 80s. And her dad was a East German officer called Katja Hoyer. And she's released a book recently about life in the East, and the name escapes me. Beyond the Wall, that's the name of it, Beyond the Wall. And it's really interesting because she talks in there about how care packages, once the wall went up, care packages could be sent back and forward. And she remembers that the packages had a particular smell. Not long afterwards, I think it might be even recently, you could supposedly buy these scents on the internet that meant to reproduce the smell of the East, the old East. I mean, it all plays into that nostalgia piece, doesn't it? It's just weird that they've come into a richer society, and Germany did its best to try and integrate. I mean, they did parity for the East Mark and the West Mark.
It's like a formal division between East and West with wages and various other things, and there's various reasons for that. It will take a few generations more before it's 100% fully unified. You could say that there is absolutely no difference between East and West. And obviously, we have more people who vote for the extreme right in the East of Germany than in the West. And you would think that would be the other way around, especially it's more sort of left-leaning, the East. But it isn't. It tends to be more right-leaning nowadays.
I think that's very applicable to most countries have a part of a country that's left behind. But I was reading recently that there's this feeling from the East that the West Germans look down upon them, see them as bit as yokels, if you like. Is that true in your experience?
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say they look down on it. I don't think nobody looks down on them. I think sometimes in the West, they think that maybe the East demanded too much when they came over. In one way, they had a thing where the wall came down, and basically what they did with a lot of the firms in the East is they sold them off, but they sold them off for virtually nothing. Yeah. And they in the hope that there'd be investment and it would rise up faster. But as usual, welcome to capitalism. They sold them off dead cheap. And obviously what happened first, these firms were cut up and people were thrown out and didn't have a job. And there's some places in the East, recently there was a report on a place called, I think it was the Zwickau, which is right on the Polish border. You can't, more east can't you go. They said that there they couldn't even get before in the time of the East, they couldn't get anything from the West, not even radio programs and things like that. And the town itself has very low unemployment. Beautiful town, built up. Everyone seems to be happy there. An ideal life, but they all tend to vote more for the extreme right there.
Mm. And have they got any conclusions?
Phenomenon. No, I don't really know. I mean, I'm not a political expert or sociologist or anything, but it seems that like the control aspect of it, and it's very clear to what these people are saying. It's they tend to go for that.
Would you say that's in the German character?
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's as the Germans would say, "Jein."
Sat the fence.
It's like yes and no together. Yeah, they seem to appreciate when things are laid out in black and white. I think we all do in a way, but the Germans like to do it more. On the other side, they are very, because of the Second World War and because of the past. You know, the Germans aren't just the Second World War, and they have a long past before that. But because of that, they've learned a lot. And their attitude is obviously anything to do with extreme right. I've read somewhere there's only one other nation, apart from Germany, that bans the swastika. And I think it's, of all places, or I think it was wearing Nazi uniform or something in public. And I think that's Australia, of all places.
Mm.
And everywhere else you can wear that. I mean, might be certain conditions attached to it. But the Germany is obviously, they're very, very cagey about things like that.
We were talking before as well, you worked beside a former, was that a T-72 tank driver?
T-55, called Gerald.
That's not very German.
Well, in German, Gerald.
Okay. At least make an effort.
He was in the East German army from 81 to 84. And it was interesting that he said that in East Germany, he said at 16, he used to get a medical. And he said, basically, that's said, you know, are you fit for service? Obviously, he didn't go in at 16. But he said he went down on the list, and when you were fit at 16, he said you went on this list, and when you were 18, you were called up. You took your medical at the place that you were called up to, so you actually went to the barracks. And he said there was no case of saying, well, I'm not fit enough, or I'm not doing this. He said everybody went, yeah, and they would sort out. And he said they would, regardless of your ability, they would slot you into somewhere into the thing. So even a guy turned up, he said we had a wooden leg. And he said the first day there, he said it was basically, he said that they just get coveralls, yeah, and then they'd sort it about. They first start marching around in groups and things like that. And they said, we're going to go over the assault course just to do, you know, slowly, just to get integrated. This guy turned around and said, well, I can't do that. He says, well, why not? He said, well, I've got big legs. So he went, they'll carry you over. And he said the next day or two, he was gone, yeah, but he was still stamped down that he could do certain types of labor in the military if it came to a crunch. So he said there was no turning around and saying, well, I can't touch things like that. It's, you know, it's too greasy, it's too dirty, or it's too hard for me. She said, no, that didn't exist in East Germany. So they would find something you could do regardless.
You said he was in 81 to 84. Was that standard then, a 3 years conscription?
Normally did 18 months, yeah. He said to me he was a bit of a bad boy, and he got into a fight. And he was, you know, I said, well, you know, you got a bit of a punch-up. He goes, well, actually, it was more than a punch-up. He said, I could have gone to jail. Well, he said, you know, come up to this time where you did service. She said, I'm going to volunteer to do 3 years. She said, and that was as a driver. And they said, well, okay, if you go volunteer for 2 years, we'll give you a fine, we'll give you a sentence. And that was it. And so he went into the East German army. And so they said that he could become a mechanic driver. All the drivers, they went in for 3 years. For the other years, went in for 18 months. And he had quite a good, he went to the NCO school first in a place called Weisswasser in East Germany. And he got trained as a mechanic driver. And then he went to the Panzer Regiment 8 in Goldberg-Jelland, which is in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, which is a state in East Germany. Basically served on the T-55 all the time.
Was being on tanks quite prestigious?
Well, yeah, he said it was in a way. It was a good job as a driver. He said you were highly trained. It was absolutely amazing the knowledge he had. And I could ask him about what type of oil did you use for this, what type of procedure, and he knew everything about his vehicle. And he said that you stayed with the vehicle all the time. If the vehicle went to the workshops. He said, you stayed with it. If it was lent out to everybody, you went with it. So he said, you were very attached to your vehicle and you knew all the ins and outs of it.
It's interesting because if you remember back to when we were at the LRRP school, I always remember things like the instruction there was that the East Germans had quite a good reputation. And I think the Czechs did as well. So some of these Soviet satellite states had a reputation for being quite good military-wise. And did he ever tell you what life was like on exercise?
I used to ask him, I said, how often do you exercise? And he goes, well, he said, quite often. He said, and from what I gathered, the general impression with it is distance between officers and NCOs, that was slightly different to ours. The officers seemed to be more closer to them, more like senior NCOs, I should say, the way they reacted. Because he said he got into some FD arguments with a few of them that he would never do in the British Army, yeah? Mm. And he said, once I was actually punched by an officer, he said, I wanted to punch him back. He said, but because I was, that's what he's actually thought. I'd punch him back. He said, but no, he was what they call Vorbestraf, which means he's already been in front of the courts. He said that could have gone out very bad for me. So he said, I was fuming and so I didn't do that. Yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting because I think automatically you think a dictatorship like that would be different. It'd be more like the British model on steroids. But also, if I remember correctly, the German Wehrmacht in World War II, their NCO cadre was quite strong back then. I'm just wondering if that was a carry.
Yeah, I think they have a very, very strong NCO cadre, and they have more ranks in the as NCOs. They play a big thing in Germany what they call Kameradschaft, which is comradeship. But we regard it as it was something quite sort of warm, yeah. Mm. There, it's like respect for there, and you carry on and you work for each other. It's played quite heavily in the German idea of service.
All right, and is that a specific East German thing, or do you see that in West Germany?
No, I think it comes from the generally German thing in itself.
And you're telling me of how there was a time he was put out on sentry duty and left there for hours, and
yeah, he was saying what happened. He said they had to go on standby. He said it was butcher queue up because he said there was things going on in Poland at the time. They were only allowed to unbutton one button, and the thing they laid on their beds with their weapons and all the rest of it. And he said my boots were soaking because we had something to do before. And suddenly they were called out, and he was put out in the woods. He said they were all put out at various places. He said no contact with each other, and they were told just to say, wait here, don't let anyone come past. And he didn't have a radio, didn't have a telephone, and he said it was in snow and winter, and they just left him there. And he said it was actually he said I was quite terrified because people actually do go missing on these exercises. And I don't know if it was an urban legend or not, but I've seen this on the German TV as well. They said about the Stasi. The Stasi used to have apparently, or their special forces, the East German special forces, used to have squads that went out for prisoner snatches. I say it was an urban legend or not, but it was rumored that they went out, tried to take people prisoners, very enthusiastic, and sometimes it went wrong on normal recruits, and that's why they disappeared. Yeah, he was scared. He said he did see someone lurking around. He said in the dark there, and he said, but he didn't say a thing. He watched him. It was his shadow, and he said it went off. He said there was someone there, and he reported it, and he said so he did investigate. But he eventually stayed there, and he was so frightened. He said he eventually got exposure. He basically passed out. And then when they were back at camp, they realized that they had left someone behind. They went out to him, found him, took him back, put him in a hot bath and everything. And he was in hospital for the next 2 or 3 weeks afterwards. And he was saying that things like accidents and people disappearing. And he said normal accidents. He said there was in the garages, there was a big board with photos. He said the actual photos of when they found these people as a warning to people, you've got to watch yourself with normal industrial type accidents, people that have been behind vehicles that reverse, people that have been sleeping under tanks and things like that. And these were all reminders. They were quite grisly, the pictures, to them to remind them to be careful, basically.
That's quite interesting because that was a hallmark back in our day. I remember when we were in Dortmund, there was guys killed down the gun park. Guy got reversed onto the garage wall. There was guys regularly killed on the big exercises. And you sent me some photographs, which I'll post at the bottom of the show notes for this pod. Yeah. But the photographs he sent you, it could be British guys next to a British tank. Yeah. That just struck me, those photographs, just how similar young men are in any army.
Some of the things he told me, when he said we used to go, I said, obviously we used to get drunk and stuff like that. And he would say there's characters, there was a person he didn't like and he had to punch up with him at some time and things like that. All sort of things, he said, just the same, basically. They had a big inspection, the general come around, and they basically had an idiot. They would try to hide this idiot. He said to get him out of the way.
He had done that.
All the things that we do now, or we've done, in some form or other.
Yeah, don't let him near the general. Get a shot of him for the inspection.
Yeah, exactly.
And did he ever say what they were? So they were going on exercise like us, and they were like us generally in the way they behaved. But did he ever give an inclination about what they were told about us as an enemy?
They were told that the Germans wouldn't do anything. They said, "Oh, they won't fire on us. You know, we're all brothers anyway." And he said, basically, the main enemy was us and the Americans. Yeah.
Mm.
And I think they were relying a bit too much on the Germans to not fire them. I think the Germans were quite on the west side would have done quite easily because they weren't going to give up an inch of land. Their policy was not to leave any land behind. Ours was to go back first, and then fight from a defensive position. But they did want to give up an inch, which I can understand. And so I think they were relying too much on that.
Yeah, and it's also interesting how there was very much from the Soviet side, and obviously within these Germans as well, they're reliant on chemical weapons and tactical nuclear weapons. And in the 80s, you saw that shift as well, whereby the West Germans were very much getting anti about their country being used for tactical nuclear weapons. And I wonder if that's played into that, where they put up a strong fight in order to prevent tactical nuclear weapons being used. I don't know. It's such a strange time because they just showed Threads this week. Do you remember Threads? I don't know if you remember that from back in the day. So with a film about a Russian nuclear attack on the UK. It was released in 1984. Oh, okay. And I watched it. And yeah, some of the special effects are a bit clunky, but it really brought back to me the fear that we all had back then of nuclear weapons in general.
It's interesting you mentioned that because they've just allowed American to post rockets back in Germany, strategic missiles back in Germany.
Oh, nuclear weapons?
Not nuclear, but the fact is that they're coming back.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so we're seeing this Cold War situation, the wheels turning round again. And there's been protests against that as well. There's like a sort of piece, but they don't rock us back because they could be targets and the rest of it. Why can't we sort this out in other means? We're seeing this sort of the Cold War coming back to Germany slowly.
I think it was you said to me, chat we had a couple of years ago, you're saying that the trouble with Germany post-Second World War is that we as in the West, did too good a job in pacifying them and making them peaceniks and all the rest of it. With the war in Ukraine, the impression I get that Germany is still reluctant to arm. They've given a lot of money to Ukraine. They're giving Taurus missiles, but with heavy restrictions. The average German in the street, what are their thoughts on the war in Ukraine and Germany's involvement?
That is quite a wide difference. It depends who you talk to. If you're talking to someone who's more, so we say centre-right leaning, centre, left or right have a tendency to think, obviously, we should support Ukraine. The extreme right in Germany, we'll say it's the extreme right, they tend to be side with Russia. It seems a bit bizarre. Obviously, being extreme right, they tend to lean towards that side more. But they tend to lean with Russia. Also, from the extreme left, they tend to side with Russia more. They want to sort it out by other means. I think generally most people agree that Ukraine should be supported. Germany in itself, I think, they've given a lot of money out for refugees from Ukraine. Their argument is that if the refugees come here, they get money from the state to look after them. The money will be going back into the state because they were spending it here, they're working here. Mm. So that it's also a certain form of logic, you could say. But they're also getting a lot of weaponry. And also people like Rheinmetall, they're testing a lot of kit out there and they're producing equipment now, which is unbelievable.
Is there still that pacifist edge in society over there, though, do you reckon?
Yeah, there is a bit. I think, it's... but I think my own personal opinion is that I think generally in the world, since the Second World War, since about sort of the 80s, that we've had it too good, we've had it too peaceful. I think only countries like Scandinavia who've been neutral, who've had this threat all the time, they've realised that there is a threat on the doorstep. They've kept that up. They kept this war mode up. But we've been thinking, oh no, there's only going to be a war in Europe again. No, that can never happen. Mm. Yeah, we will for these tiny counterinsurgency wars. That's what we thought.
You've lived in Germany since, 84 or something? Is that correct? 84?
Well, since just after Gulf, I came out, yeah.
Yeah, so you were first out there in sort of the early 80s. Then you left and we get sent back to the UK in 91. So you've basically been out in Germany for like 40 years. So you've seen a huge change in this. You've seen that full circle, if you like, coming back to that sort of Cold War effect.
Yeah, it's quite strange because when we were in Germany, we used to exercise in Germany. I mean, we relied on the locals a lot. And they were very helpful, yeah. And even if they maybe didn't like the army running around and stuff like that, they could understand there was these huge exercises, and you can't the fact that you would go back to, if you did run these exercises in England as we ran then, you just take over people's farmland. We just drive through it.
Through crops.
Few crops here, we give you a bit of money afterwards and everything, planes flying around and there was troops moving through. And it was absolutely incredible. But most Germans it was not nice for them, but they could see the reason why, sort of thing. And there was obviously a peace movement, because obviously it's to do with a lot to with the student movement and everything at the time. And maybe it was just the fact that things were good in Germany for the economy and everything like that.
Yeah, it was a past. I remember being on damage control on exercise, and you'd be having chits to give to farmers that would pay for damage to their crops or if the streets were torn up. But yeah, you'd see regiments of tanks just powering through a village, ripping up curbstones, and the German population just sort of took that as routine. When you look back on it now, it's quite remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, I remember going in, finding our GDP, which is our general deployment areas, yeah. We would actually go out and select our own, yeah. And most units would get them from higher up. You'd get a grid or something where you go to a position, but we actually selected our own. And we would go into villages to look around. And one of our cover stories was, we used to tell them that we were maneuver control. We were looking to see if the village was suitable for armored vehicles. And they would look at you and they would go, "Oh, what are you going to say?" And it was a bit like the man from Del Monte, the old thing. At the end of it, we'd look around and say, "We say this village is not suitable for armored vehicles." They would go, "Ah." But in the meantime, we say, "Oh, can we have a look down at the end of your garden?" and things like this in position. We just want to look at them. Say, "Yeah, please do." People would invite you in. Yeah. And we would say, "Oh, can we look up here from your attic?" "Yeah, please do." And it was absolutely amazing.
I remember being on exercise, signals exercise, where we bomb bursted the four winds all across Germany. I don't know if you were with me this time, but we were on the edge of a wood setting up some comms, and an old guy who's actually probably our age now, looking back on it, this would be the mid-80s, and his son came along, and his son could speak English and his father couldn't. And his son came up to me and was saying, "My dad was in the army during the war, and could he see some of your equipment?" And as in like personal equipment. So we showed him the contents of their Bergens and all that type of thing. Yeah. I've been a bit suspicious. We kept him away from all the radio kit. But it was interesting, this guy translating through his father about that. They were in Russia and they just had great coats and blankets, and they used to go and wake people up to go on sentry duty, and the guy would be frozen to death during the night. And I think it's weird that we didn't appreciate how close the Second World War was to us then, and the living memory in Germany in that sort of period as well.
We'd come across a few people that fought in the war, and I remember we were out doing an exfiltration. We came to this big, huge hedge, burst through the hedge, and it was basically this was in winter. Came to a camping site, one or two caravans, and you get people in Germany that do camp over. They call them Dauer campers, they're long-term campers. And a German came out of his tent, and he said, "Oh," he said, "what are you looking for?" And we thought, well, we'll put the radio up here, and we put the radio up. And it was next to his thing, and his wife came out, and she made us coffee. She cooked us eggs and stuff like that. Totally hospitable. And he was watching what I was doing because I had the radio set up. And we were told, obviously, our communications was all meant to be very secret and things like that. And he was looking at me, and he came over and had a look at it, and he's looking at the code book, and he's saying, and I was trying to steer him away, being polite in that. But he's saying, and he goes, "Your HQ has got exactly the same code book, hasn't it?" And he says, and he does that, and he explained how the codes went. I was going, "How do you know?"
This is one-time pads, effectively. We were using a step behind.
Yeah, he goes, "Well, that's the system we used with Enigma during the Second World War. I was in Rommel's, in one of Rommel's hauptquartiers in Normandy, and he was actually the guy who worked the Enigma machine. So he understood the principle of how codes work and things like that."
Amazing.
There was another guy who we went to try to use his attic to overlook an area. And the son said, "Well, I have to bring my father up first." And father came up with a walking stick. And he said, "Can these soldiers use our attic?" Because it was his house. He was the head of the whole family. And he looked us up and down, and he said, "What country are you from?" We said, "Well, the British soldiers." And he goes, "I was shot by an English guy in the war." So no attic today. And then he said, he explained to us what happened. It was quite interesting. He said he was in Normandy at the time. He was cut off a bit from his own guys. He wandered away, was a bit lost, went into the village. He looked down, and he said left and right down the street. There was no one there. He said, "Look right." He said, "There was no one there." Look left, no one there. Stepped down the street. looked back to the left. And he said there was a British soldier standing there. And he said, we were both surprised. He said, he was quicker and he shot me. And he said, I fell back into a ditch. And I said, I could hear his hobnail boots running down the road. And he said, that's it. He said, I'm going to get painted now. He said, this is the end. And he said, the guy found him, apologised.
That's very British, isn't it?
Apologised, patched his wound up, carried him back to the first aid. And he said, and that was it. He was in Gefangenschaft as a prisoner of war. And he said, we thought, whew. So we got our attic in the end.
Was it you to tell me as well when you were on Swingfire, which was an anti-tank piece of kit, that you were wrecking positions and some old boy showed you the best place because he'd actually fought on that bit of ground?
Yeah, that was quite amazing because he asked what the vehicle was for. And I said, it's an anti-tank vehicle. And he was very sort of portly German with his Vacherons there and puffing away his cigar. And he's going, oh, yes. And we were told to be friendly to him, but don't let him inside the vehicles. It wasn't then in the brains of an archbishop to work out what it was. And I was saying, we're in a taxi. He goes, oh, that's a really good tactic. And he goes, but if you go down there, he said, there's a better position. I was going, oh, armchair general, are we? I was going, why is that then? And he said, why? He said, I knocked out 2 Sherman tanks down there. And I was going, wow, that's incredible. And he was at the end of the war. He was dragged off to defend this village. And he said they put an anti-tank gun there. The Americans came forward. We thought they'd just roll over us. He said, but once you hit the first vehicles, he said, they all stop. He said, they want to know where it's come from. And they walked down to him. And it was quite incredible. He said, this depression here, he said, where the gun there and one over there. And he told me exactly what it was like. So it was always quite interesting to meet people like that in Germany at that time.
Yeah, and I was going out with a German girl back in the day, and her grandmother's side of the family, her grandmother was round one day, and obviously I couldn't speak German, she couldn't speak English. My girlfriend at the time was translating. Her grandmother had no living male relatives. They were all killed in the war.
Yeah.
And she was in Dortmund during the war, and Dortmund suffered one of the heaviest bomb raids.
It was one of the most bombed places in Germany, Dortmund was.
And she was describing that the air raids warning would start. They go into the cellars. She said you could hear the bombers approaching. There was that many of them, before the bombs fell. And they lived in ruins for a couple of years after the war. Looking at it back then, I was sort of, early 20s and sort of a bit embarrassed. But I just think, I could have asked so many questions, you know what I mean, about, but you didn't want to because there's that, I don't know if embarrassment's the right word. Yeah, it was a strange.
Whenever I can, I talk quite a lot to the Germans about the Second World War and how they feel about it and things like that. Obviously, there's people more our age or younger people. Obviously, it was different for the Germans than it is for us, yeah. They still got the sting with the Holocaust hanging over them and everything. But we don't see the Germans how they might think that other people see them, yeah. And I say, the war is over, and that's it. And we've all learned a lot since then. I think it's like that's happened in the past, basically, for us. But even today, they find, almost, I was saying once a month, they find a bomb around here when they're building a building site.
Mm.
So there's often whole blocks are closed down because they find a bomb somewhere and they've got to evacuate all the people. It's got to be defused and then people can go back there. But that happens regularly. That I would say once a month, once every 2 months, they find one. And before you build here as well, your building plans have to go to the local council and they check that with the bomb splashes, pictures from the Second World War, see if a bomb might be there.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? So, mate, we're going to wrap it up on this one. Thanks for your time, Kim. We'll speak soon. That's it for another episode. Thanks to our guests for coming to our podcast and to you, the listener, for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming, and our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you download us from iTunes or Spotify and like the podcast, it'd be great if you could leave us a review there or anywhere you get your podcasts from. Thanks again to Nick Beals for continuing to help and offering technical support for his company ISAR, and we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.